Robert? Cool. Okay, so for today, we have a great agenda ahead of us. We're focusing on equity in the electric vehicle space. So we have three speakers who will be joining us and presenting three different perspectives on equity and electric vehicles. Dr. Margaret Taylor from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Komal Doshi from Walker Miller Energy Services, and Dr. Shelley Francis from EVNoire. I'll introduce each of them with their bios as we get to their presentations. But just as a reminder, we will then have our speaker Q&A at the end of all three of the presentations, just like we've been doing this for a while now. So we won't pause after each of the presentations. We'll just take one big pause after all three, and you can answer or ask whatever questions you want to any of the three presenters. So all three will be sticking around until that Q&A. And then after the Q&A portion, we will have our peer sharing discussion. And that's just with commissioners and commission staff in a closed session for about those final 25 minutes of today's call. And please feel free to enter your questions into the chat at any time. I know it can be a while before you actually have the opportunity to ask the question out loud. So if you'd prefer to just type it in as it comes to your mind, you can do that and enter that into the chat at any time, and then we'll get to them during that speaker Q&A. Okay, and then we've got our, I like this EV fact of the week on our slide there, Robert, if you want to just go back very quickly. I just wanted to highlight that the pace of North American battery cell production announcements have grown more than 10 times higher by mid-2024 than 2021. I don't know, is that a question, Robert, or is that our fact? I just noticed the question mark at the end there. Is that a true or false?
It's phrased as a question because it's it's phrased as if, did you know that they've grown this much?
Okay, I understand. Thank you. Okay, so did you know that they have grown 10 times more than by mid-2024 than in 2021? Okay, thanks. All right, now we can move on. All right. So I already briefly introduced our three guest speakers, but I'll go into more of an introduction with a bio for our first speaker today from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. This is Dr. Margaret Taylor. Margaret is a Lawrence Berkeley National Lab research scientist affiliated with several units of the University of California, Berkeley, where she was a public policy professor for 10 years. Her research advances knowledge about people's decisions to invent, adopt, and use technologies and services that help reduce climate change emissions and impacts. She's also a Fulbright Canada Research Chair at the University of Ottawa, and she co-chaired the Behavior Energy Climate Change Conference for 6 years. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Margaret Taylor for her presentation.
Thank you so much. So I'll be speaking with you today to provide an overview of the Joint Office United Support for Transportation Lab Consortium, which we call the JUST Lab Consortium. This is a group of three national laboratories, Argonne, NREL, and Lawrence Berkeley Lab, that have joined forces to help support this new office, the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, as they support the EV infrastructure rollout, among other aspects of a new electrified transportation system. But our focus has been to help support the office with respect to equity. So could you go to the next slide? So I have just a few things to sort of give you guys an overview today. First, we'll talk a little bit about the policy context. We'll talk a bit about our JUST Lab Consortium and the suite of activities that we've done over the last couple of years, and also highlight some of the resources that we could provide, and then share some insights. Could you go ahead to the next slide? So policy context, much of this won't be new to you guys. Next slide. but we'll just start here with Justice 40. So it was one of the very first actions of the Biden administration was to pass Executive Order 14,008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. Now, this predated the two major pieces of legislation that ultimately came through, but part of the executive order said that as we would have a lot more federal funds towards climate work, climate technologies, climate innovation, we wanted to make sure that there was a goal that 40% of the overall benefits of these sorts of federal investments flow to disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. So about 6 months later, in July 2021, they have interim agency guidance that define disadvantaged communities with several different, there should have been 7, I messed up the numbering. Anyway, so it was tribal is a disadvantaged community in the agency guidance, whether owned property or not. There's low income, high poverty, persistent unemployment is a definition. Places with segregation history or linguistic isolation is another way that disadvantaged communities are defined. Also, a range of things that involve high cost or low quality or low access with respect to housing, transportation, energy, water, sanitation, and healthcare. This sort of is a big set of definitions for disadvantaged communities. There's also communities with environmental stressors or cumulative environmental harms, places that will be seeing climate impacts disproportionately. So thinking about sea level rise, for example, and then finally, places that are having displacement with job loss related to the energy transition. So I wanted to put these definitions out there because you can see that any agency that is administering funds from the two laws that come out have to be thinking about disadvantaged communities and have to be thinking about how you measure benefits such that 40% can go to these disadvantaged communities. So it's been a really interesting organizational principle as agencies have formed and causes people to really think about what are benefits and how does one assess those benefits. One of the aspects of the interim guidance is that benefits assessment needs to involve stakeholder engagement directly to determine what those benefits should be, although it does outline a range of specific types of benefits. Can we go to the next slide? So here's the other aspect of this policy. So context, which is what is the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation? So it comes out of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which many of us affectionately call the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And that came into November 2021. So after this agency guidance, et cetera. And the MOU to start the office, which is jointly between the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, that happened in December 2021. The mission of the Joint Office is to accelerate an electrified transportation system is affordable, convenient, equitable, reliable, and safe. It has 4 main areas that it oversees from within the BIL and other things. So the NEVI formula funding program, in which across alternative fuel corridors, which are basically along highways, every 50 miles within 1 mile of the highway, you need to have a build out. And once your build out is reached for new public EV infrastructure, then you can take additional formula funds to communities. This formula funding goes to state departments of transportation, much in the way that highway funds typically flow. There's also 3 other aspects of the Joint Office's mission: the community chargers, there's zero emission transit, and then zero emission school buses. So anyway, can we go to the next slide? So our Just Lab Consortium in this context is like, okay, this is a brand new agency. It's basically around for like 5 years. It's got quite an interesting range of new a new mission, a new technology, new players, because state DOTs haven't done much in the past necessarily with EV infrastructure. So so how are we going to think about helping the Joint Office to in this Justice 40 context? Can you go to the next slide? So we approached it with 3 different research directions. So one aspect was that let's learn from on the ground EV charging experience in a non-federally funded context. Like, what have we been seeing in general from equity issues with EV charging? We also took a look at sort of this academic equity and environmental justice lens on sustainable transportation broadly. And then we also focused within the NEVI problem context. What are the state DOT needs and capabilities? What are their self-defined needs? And what are Joint Office does a lot of technical assistance. What are the technical assistance regional TA leads noticing about ways that we could help state DOTs, like as they figure out how to do this formula funding and approach and thinking about the equity issues. And then also taking a step back, what would be sort of a normative kind of approach to TA development? So like how would we think about operationalizing metrics or providing additional tools for states that might want additional resources or approaches? So so those are the sort of ways we went about this. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so this translated into this very complicated graph. So you'll see fiscal year 23 on the left. So all of those research directions get turned into various tasks where we do part of the formula funding is they have to write every year what is their sort of state plan for how they're going to approach the NEVI program that year. And there's part of the equity, there's a part of a state plan template that the Joint Office provides and Federal Highway that actually has an equity section to it and stuff. So anyway, so one of the things we did was we assess what is in these state plans. We also looked at best and emerging practices and program implementation, community engagement, impacts assessments, the academic research that I mentioned before. All of these different research tasks, including piloting some tools in the context of like some of the modeling tools that the national laboratories bring to the table, piloting that in the NEVI context in a couple of states, the Justice 40 metrics, all of that work has been multiple different deliverables and reports and things, and they go into different aspects of equity TA delivery channels. And then this year we're kind of continuing with this but yet more in the way of technical assistance for the broader community that's supporting the rollout and the broader Joint Office mission. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is our website, driveelectric.gov, Just Lab Consortium. You'll see a number of resources that we have that I'll be breezing through shortly, but they're all there on the right. And as more of our deliverables come live, they'll be put into that section too. There's everything from past webinars we've done to help sheets, case studies, big reports. So there's a wealth of material if you'd like to kind of dive into this topic from multiple different research directions. And we're very happy to help and provide additional resources and work with people however we can. That's what we're here for. Can we go to the next slide? So depending on some timing, I'll just breeze through some of the insights here. Can you go to the next slide? So on that element of learning from on-the-ground EV charging experience in non-federally funded context, next slide. We have 5 different case studies that sort of synthesize what's learned in various different places. We also have a big principles report. One of my colleagues just posted the link to our website in the chat, Alina Wilson, so she'll be online as well to help answer any questions in the Q&A portion today. So these are some of the reports. The principles report did more than 60 EVSE publications focusing on equity, and the case studies did 5 deep dives of multiple planning and logistics lessons learned. Next slide. Major insights about respecting community culture, empowering community members, co-designing projects, providing funds to compensate community members for participating in important ways, engaging the community regularly, reflecting back what we believe we're understanding about their goals. So the idea that it's an ongoing process, not a one-off engagement. And also some interesting aspects of building flexibility into contracting and funding to enable sort of swift response to changes in project details and payment needs. Because a lot of times as you're doing any kind of a construction building project, you end up with things have to change along the way. So anyway, so these are just some of the major insights on this work. Next slide. I want to be cognizant of the time. Learning from the academic research. Next slide. So did a broad exploration of the transportation electrification literature. So there's various frameworks we see on the left here, EJ, energy justice, energy democracy, just transition, transportation justice. A lot of these words are frameworks that are out there in different ways. They get translated through tenets like distributive justice, procedural justice, recognition justice, restorative justice, cosmopolitan justice. They get converted into applied principles. And many of these applied principles turn into many of the benefits that the J40 work has sort of, but not all. But anyway, and so this is sort of ways that you can kind of think about this. If you want to get kind of immersed in aspects of the literature, that's like one of the things that's been very helpful to kind of get ourselves on the same language. So next slide. In the NEVI problem context, there are two things, right? The state DOT needs and capabilities, and then also normative TA development. Next slide, please. This one's kind of complex. Just to highlight here in the right box, you see a bunch of lines there with a histogram, different lines of text. Those are the state plan NEVI template equity categories examples that are provided to state DOTs. So improving clean transportation access through charger location, which I believe your next speaker is going to be talking about access, decreasing transportation energy cost burden, reduce environmental exposures. We've done a lot of work with air quality. Anyway, this whole long list, there's like 10 different aspects of this that states are asked to sort of think about their methodology or how they can think about their baseline and then assessing like, how does one evaluate how your state plan approach is going to be doing on these things? And then the histogram itself is actually the number of tools and technical resources that we believed were available readily from either the federal sector or other places that could speak to these different categories. We also did a lot of outreach to different state plan preparers and things like this. So this particular report talking about sort of the needs of the state DOTs, that hasn't come live yet on our site. If you go to the next slide, please. Oh, I guess it's not there now. Okay, never mind. There's a taxonomy, an open taxonomy. I must have removed it. But anyway, I can provide a link to this overall list of like 50 some tools that are like coded by all sorts of equity benefit categories that the national labs and other places have publicly available to help with any of that material. This is about the NEVI state plans. This is a lot of what went into how we assessed the state plans. We developed some very useful review sheets specific to equity that provide consistency and comparison across years and programs with a whole scoring system per equity category. The categories are listed in the second bullet. We have a preliminary findings report. This particular report is also not quite available yet, but it's coming soon. But there's a lot of aspects of this. There's many areas for potential technical assistance across all equity categories. And then we think there's some interesting ways that we might be able to combine some of the leading state approaches with some of the JO resources in ways that could be useful to other states. Can you go to the next slide, please? Oh, it was out of order. This is the link to the taxonomy of technical resources. And that QR code over there is the way to get to it. And I'll put into the chat another way to get into it, but these are those 10 categories. Many of these technical resources are on the left. The 4 highlighted ones, the ones we've piloted. Can you go to the next slide? And this was, we did California at one point, and then we've also done Texas. The Texas piloting is actually in that same report with the type the outreach task to understand state needs. But there's a lot that comes out of this. So piloting these particular 4 tools that our labs are very familiar with can get you some very interesting information for EV infrastructure location based on things like jobs, the baseline accessibility, the air quality issues. There's just so much to mention here, but you can kind of start to see an example of the very useful kinds of data sets that can come out of being able to apply some of our lab tools with NEVI location data. Could you go to the next slide, please? And then finally, we have a metrics development report that came out in January. This one is available. It has a list of metrics relevant to each J40 policy priority category and provides for one metric in each category, example suggestions about methodology, data collection, relevant tools, and modeling capabilities. And some of the insights to mention here, one in particular we wanted to mention is that focusing exclusively on transportation infrastructure without acknowledging the need for equitable access to transportation technology is somewhat limiting. So if you go to the next slide, we have a little aside for PUCs. So we've affirmed a strong need for investments that benefit non-vehicle owning populations, as well as vehicle owning populations that do not have access to EVs soon. For non-vehicle owning households, there's a nice little example in the New York State PSC and their Make Ready program that we wanted to sort of highlight. And then also many regulatory commissions have established EV rebate programs that give higher incentive amounts to lower income households. Just a little aside. Next slide, please. I just skip right through this one, please. And then just to here, I just wanted to mention that we did ground truth all of our major deliverables from with an equity and community expert group that met quarterly to review all of our deliverables. They made a lot of key contributions to kind of connect what we were finding across these different tasks from these different research directions and grounded our understanding about equity and structural transitions needed to achieve equitable outcomes. There will be a report coming out on the contributions of this expert group, and we believe it's going to be leading to further directions. The bottom half of this slide just is sort of reiterates some of the things about the resources on our webpage. Next slide, please. And that's it. So thank you. I know that was a lot in a short time, and I hope I didn't set the overall meeting back too far by taking too much time, but I'd be very happy to help and communicate more with anybody who's interested.
No, that was perfect, Dr. Taylor. I really appreciate the presentation, and no, you did not set the meeting back. This is perfect, really excellent use of our time. So I definitely have some questions, but like I said, we're going to hold our questions until after the next 2 presenters, and then we'll have all of our presenters back at the same time to go through those. So thank you, Dr. Taylor. Next, we have our next presentation is from Komal Doshi, who has over a decade of experience working in the intersection of mobility, energy, and communities. She's currently the Vice President of Beneficial Electrification and Mobility at Walker Miller Energy Services, where she works to advance clean mobility through managing the deployment of beneficial electrification utility programs, managing installation and maintenance of EV chargers, and advancing research and community engagement in equitable clean mobility in this growing space. So at this point, I will turn it over to Ms. Doshi for your presentation.
Thank you so much. Really excited to be here, and you'll find that a lot of things I'll talk about really echo what Margaret's already covered. So it feels like the 3 presenters will really be building on very similar concepts and frameworks. So I'll start by sharing a little bit about the company I represent, Walker Miller Energy Services. It's a 24-year-old company headquartered in Detroit, Michigan. We have offices in 5 states. We're one of the largest African-American and woman-owned energy efficiency companies in the United States, and we're a proud B Corp. For those of you who don't know, that is a certification that assesses a company's ability to meet and maintain rigorous standards of social and environmental performance, accountability, and transparency. As thought leaders in clean energy equity, we're committed to help lead the charge in Michigan and across the United States to dispel the narrative that businesses must choose between a healthy culture that values people or one that generates profit. We really can do both. Next slide. Carla Walker-Miller, our founder and CEO, she says that our commitment to empower people and enrich communities means that we must do more than just talk about equity. We must budget for equity and thoughtfully and intentionally integrate it within every effort. Next slide. So through an equity lens, the company provides thought leadership to utilities, municipalities, businesses, and communities to help achieve energy reduction goals and drive the benefits of clean energy to all communities. So a big part of our program is the focus on equitable community engagement. This really aligns with the recommendations that Margaret shared earlier. It requires a hyperlocal, multicultural outreach and engagement strategy, which is paired with research and analysis with special attention to disadvantaged communities. It requires building connections with trusted residents, community-based organizations, and businesses that serve these communities. Next slide. So in order to meet our goal of advancing equity in the energy sector, we need to continuously develop our own cultural awareness. So one of the models of cultural awareness here that you are seeing shows the development from lack of awareness of diversity, moving towards fully embracing the range of cultural differences to the point where it becomes an unconscious habit. Next slide. So in order to build the cultural awareness and design inclusive programs, it is critical for us to really understand our own current privilege and power. The advantages that you currently experience may make it difficult to even notice the disadvantages that others are grappling with. So it's a privilege in and of itself that we to learn about historical disadvantages rather than experience them. So this wheel of privilege, and you might have seen many like this in other presentations, captures three different rings: power, erased, and marginalized, with the innermost ring being the most privileged and powerful, which means their opinions will be listened to and considered more than others. The middle ring is often the forgotten ring, with people in this area often having their identities erased and marginalized in unique ways. The people that exist in this on either extreme see those as middle as possible for other extremes. And the outermost ring is the most marginalized because these people experience more overt discrimination than the other rings. This particular wheel, I sourced from Just One Voice, but as you see, there are many wedges in this, and as we discuss, there will be more that we will find that we're missing. So it's a constant learning curve for us and for us to ensure that we are building inclusive programs. Next slide. Another piece while serving marginalized communities is to understand that the experience they come from living with disadvantages inherently results in trauma. So taking a trauma-informed approach to equitable community engagement includes being sensitive to the history of a community, acknowledging any known harm done, not over-promising the benefits, and compensating participants for delivering valued services. Next slide. So one example I would like to share is the work that we are doing in PICO. It's the Energy Force Ambassador Program, where we're partnering with nonprofit organizations to train adults with development disabilities to serve as ambassadors for PICO's energy efficiency initiatives. And through this program, we have successfully recruited, trained, and graduated 27 individuals from 14 nonprofit organizations throughout the PICO service territory. Next slide. Moving on to the EV space, we're really passionate about the EV revolution, and this work that we are currently doing is a result of a massive effort and financial investment that the company has undertaken 4 years ago to research and enter the EV infrastructure ecosystem. and really make space for ourselves as well as other diverse participants. Some of the offerings we currently provide are transportation and electrification program design and implementation for utilities, equitable mobility research, EV charger assessment and installation management, and advancing diversity in EV workforce. Next slide. We've built relationships and partnerships with leading charger manufacturers like Tesla, Dunamis Energy, ChargePoint, EV Connect, as well as we're resellers for Charger Health's maintenance package. Next slide. We're also the prime implementation contractor for Comet's beneficial electrification investment of $231 million in Northern Illinois. And through this program, we manage a residential EV charger purchase and installation program and business and public sector EV programs. The whole 50% and more of the funding available through these programs is aimed to be distributed to equity investment eligible communities and low-income communities. We're also the prime subcontractor for the Ameren, Illinois Beneficial Electrification Program. And through both of these programs, we're promoting equitable access to electric vehicles and supporting infrastructure, as well as recruiting and managing diverse electric vehicle service provider networks. Next slide. So our equitable mobility strategy takes into account key principles that are outlined in the Initiative for Energy Justice report. So really helping people move through the awareness and access, which is ensuring that people and communities are supported in their journey of EV awareness and EV access, moving on to targeted benefit based on equity need and goals that support EV awareness, adoption, and installation within communities. Incorporating equitable engagement to create meaningful participation experiences for community. And lastly, creating a robust community-centered journey where program participation is representative of the underserved communities within the focus of the location for mobility solutions. Next slide. But one of the key challenges, as we all know, is the fact that the EV market is really complex. And in order to engage more residential and commercial customers, we need to support these customers through their journey and really help them build confidence through data and tools. Next slide. So it begins with a better understanding of the process to participate. It includes tools that they can access. Many utilities provide fleet assessment tools, either free or at reduced rate, as well as multifamily assessment tools. They also provide hosting capacity maps for EV, which displays an estimate of the remaining circuit load capacity, guiding interested parties to areas where they can seek to install chargers with minimal need for system reinforcement. And the whole exercise here around building confidence, the goal really is to help customers better understand the timeline, the budget, and the benefits that these projects can bring them. Next slide. Phase of engagement and meaningful participation experiences in the community is helping them build the mobility solutions. So a tool that we created is our Equitable Mobility Playbook, where we are working together to drive co-creation of mobility solutions within the communities we serve. It combines methods and deliverables in human-centered design and primes us with an equity lens informed by principles of design justice and national equity projects leading for equity framework to really help with co-creation of solutions within the community. Next slide. Another piece of meaningful participation is recruitment and training of the workforce that will serve the EV industry. Walker Miller's Clean Energy Academy recently received an official certification as a Michigan proprietary school, offering paid training for participants historically excluded from the energy industry. In the EV space, we're currently managing the electric vehicle service provider network for ComEd and Ameren in Illinois. And our work really focuses on engaging these diverse contractors within the network to create opportunities for them to market themselves, as well as submit rebate applications on behalf of customers. But it's also an avenue for us to educate folks that might be technicians or electricians by trade, but have not yet entered the electric vehicle industry, of the opportunity there exists and the certifications they might require to be participants in this industry. Next slide. I mentioned the equity journey, so this is kind of bringing it all full circle. So we work with the communities to really assess the programs and the initiatives alongside the criteria I had spoken about earlier. So helping identify what are the components that we want to measure alongside the criteria of equitable access, benefits, participation, engagement, and representation. Next slide. So thank you for letting me share a little bit about our work. Here are my contact details. Happy to answer questions in the Q&A section, as well as to discuss further offline with any of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate the presentation and the perspective that you were able to share. So we have one final presentation, and then we'll be able to get to questions for all three of our presenters. And our final presenter is Dr. Shelley Francis, who is a former medical school faculty member. She's a multifaceted public health executive, a tech entrepreneur, and a disruptor in transportation. As the co-founder and managing partner of EVNoire, a specialized technology consultancy, she focuses on electric, connected, shared, and autonomous e-mobility solutions. With an emphasis on two key pillars, e-mobility best practice and e-mobility diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her team provides strategic business solutions for a diverse range of entities, from utilities and nonprofits to auto manufacturers, municipalities, and government agencies. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Francis for the final presentation today.
Thank you very much. It's always hard to be the last person. So I'm trying to keep people energized and excited about what we're talking about. So really excited to be here with you guys this afternoon to just share some of our experiences and what we've learned from working in multifamily housing, equitable access to EV charging, as well as working in the rural community space. So we can go ahead and get right into it. So next slide, please. And as she shared, so in terms of my background, my firm is a consultancy, EVNoire. We work on electric, connected, shared, and autonomous mobility solutions for the public and the private sector. And so we've been working on a myriad of different types of projects. So whether it is looking at fleet electrification or how utilities show up and their role in the electrification space, I think is really important. These are two of the hardest issues to address, or the hardest challenges in our space. So it's really important that we're having this conversation today. So our aim in the work that we facilitate is to really make sure that all communities have access to this type of clean energy and technology, and that they have the opportunity to, breathe air, live in communities that are devoid of toxic air pollution, can help them grow their economies, provide workforce and economic development opportunities, and address environmental toxins. So again, our mission is to really do this work in a data-driven, client and community-centered way. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot of our leadership team. It's really important to us that our team is reflective of the different communities that we work in across the country. Next slide. So this is, again, here is just a snapshot of some of the organizations that we work with. So you can see it's a diverse array of partners from, the current administration to transportation, consultancies, utilities and co-ops, rideshare, and more. Next slide. So our team brings a wealth of experience around this space. Some of our team members are, I'm a former member of the Electric Vehicle Association, and I sit on Secretary Buttigieg's Transforming Transportation Advisory Committee. Others of our members are experts, they're engineers, data and research scientists, urban planners, transportation and infrastructure experts as well. So I think it's really important to have diverse perspectives looking at some of these issues and challenges that we're facing in the sector. Next slide. Okay, so one of the reasons that we're here today, so as manufacturers are continuing to commit to transitioning to 100% EV offerings, as well as public and private investment, they're continuing to make investments in this space. It's really going to become critically important to make sure that we're expanding access to EV charging. Obviously, there are numerous benefits and positives to doing this, so ranging from environmental impacts to social equity. In terms of the environmental impacts, obviously reducing emissions and dependence in fossil fuel is a significant benefit, as well as building out workforce and economic development opportunities and thinking about just the financial benefits of the lower operating costs that EVs provide. Then when we think about social equity, so making sure that all demographics can access this technology, this is all critically important and at top of mind as we grapple with some of these issues. Next slide. When we think about, EV growth, we know that each year EV sales continue to increase. So, currently, these are some key demographics that we are seeing right now in the space. We have, any number, upwards of over 150 different types of models available. We're growing the infrastructure in terms of access to charging stations and charging ports. But all getting back to, there are certain populations that may not have access to charging infrastructures as other communities. Next slide. When we think about where and when charging happens, we know that the majority of charging is happening at home, then followed by the workplace. And so when we think about solidifying our commitment to expanding access to environmental, health, and financial benefits of clean transportation, one of the commitments that we've made as an organization is to be part of the network. It's called the EV Charging for All Coalition, and it's an advisory group or a coalition that's advocating for equitable electric vehicle charging infrastructure in the Cal Green Building Codes. Another important piece of this conversation is thinking about policy. So Atlanta, where I'm currently based, was one of the first large cities to enact a EV-ready policy for new construction. And so we have the opportunity to provide feedback and advisement on that. And we've done that for several other cities as well. Next slide. I started off our conversation talking about this. So this is an issue that we're all facing. Solving the issue of equitable access to multifamily EV charging is one of the most challenging issues as we transition to a cleaner mobility future. And that's one of the things that our team is working extremely hard to solve this particular complex mobility problem. Next slide. When we start thinking about, some of the unique barriers that we face when dealing with this issue. So we are dealing with things like, space constraints, electrical upgrades. We're also dealing with, the high upfront cost of installation, infrastructure limitations in terms of limiting parking and electrical capacity. We might be dealing with regulatory hurdles, so dealing with building codes and pesky HOA boards that are pushing back on providing access to charging infrastructure. So, there are a myriad of different barriers that you might be facing when looking at EV charging in multifamily properties. You may also be dealing with the age of the property as well. So let's move forward to the next slide. When we start looking at housing stock in the United States, you can see there's quite a significant number of consumers living in multifamily units. And then when you start looking at the number of units, that there's a significant number of multifamily units and properties across the country. Next slide. Now, this slide is just depicting, the distribution of residents who are living in these properties, and then we're looking at home ownership in the United States by race. And so, as you can see, that varies by race and ethnicity. One of the populations that are not are least likely to be homeowners, like 55% of African Americans do not own their homes. So when we start thinking about looking at the map on the right and the distribution of home ownership, if people are thinking about places where they can charge and thinking about EV adoption, one of the things that is top of mind based on research that we facilitated is just charging access is a big sticking point for people and a big point of concern. Next slide. When we start thinking about the top markets, when we look at multifamily and EV infrastructure, these are the top markets that come to the surface. So as you can see, the trend is there are a number of markets on the West Coast, and there are fewer on the East Coast in terms of the highest density of multifamily EV infrastructure. And some of that is driven by policy. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through the presentation. Next slide. When we start thinking about, the best practices for multifamily housing, these are some of the things that we found in our work as well as in the literature that should be top of mind and should definitely be things that are implemented. So first of all, you want to make sure that you are, assessing your site. So I can't highlight the importance of knowing what you're dealing with, both from the housing stock standpoint, but also from the opportunities of what's happening with that building, with the residents, with the property managers. So really understanding both, what data is available, what rebate and incentives are available to communities as they're starting to build out this infrastructure strategy. Thinking about financial incentives is critically important because obviously that can help defray the cost of implementing infrastructure, charging infrastructure programs. I noted on the previous slide that policy is helping to drive some of the advancement that you see in other markets around EV infrastructure in multifamily dwellings. And I think also partnership is really critically important. So having that public-private partnership with utilities, with your local clean city or your EV advocacy organizations, having the ear of policymakers, regulators, and more can really help, make this a much more supportive environment and much more strategic in terms of, deploying infrastructure here. So I already touched on community engagement to a certain extent, but it's also really important to make sure that your consumers, ratepayers understand the benefits of electrification and having that infrastructure in their community or in their building. Next slide. Okay, so some innovative ways that you can deal with charging for multifamily settings. There are a number of different programs. I'm just highlighting a few. So one of the programs is the program that's facilitated by Austin Energy. And so this is a way to make charging affordable to much wider audiences. So the Austin Energy program is called Plug-in Everywhere, and that program offers unlimited charging at over 1,000 public charging ports in the Austin metro area. It's a program that costs $4.17 per month. And so for less than $50 a year, residents are able to sign up for this program. You have to sign up at 6 months at a time and pay in advance, but that would be $25. And another added bonus is that the charging ports are powered by 100% renewable clean energy. So really exciting program there. Then there is this other program here on the right that's offered by Florida Power and Light. And so they offer charging on the weekends and the evenings, as you can see here, for $31 a month. And they also provide some additional incentives for infrastructure. If you need installation of charging at your home, there's some other rebates and programs that will help defray the cost of that as well. The project in the middle is a case study that I want to share. It's a project that we worked on. And so this is just a photo depicting the overall project, but another innovative solution to offering charging and charging infrastructure to folks who are living in multifamily units is street light charging, or street lamp or lamppost charging. And so one of the projects that we worked on was the Kansas City Metropolitan charging program. So we worked with their local Clean Cities affiliate and a number of different partners, including the local utility and a number of stakeholder groups. And so the idea or the premise and goal of the project was to demonstrate how charging can be integrated with the street lamp or existing infrastructure to provide curbside access to public EV charging in the city's right of way. And that would therefore provide more access to charging for like renters, multifamily users and dwellers, businesses, local businesses, as well as taxi and rideshare drivers. Now, what we found was that there's a lot entailed in doing this. It's really important to do the site assessment. I mentioned that before. And one of the things that we found when we were doing the assessments and we walked through the community to explore different places where we might put charging infrastructure. Some of the neighborhoods that were, J40 or lower income communities, the infrastructure was just not up to par. And so obviously that impacted where charging infrastructure would be sited, but it also flagged a need for more support, financial support, and more resources to be able to address some of those issues. So, I'm kind of hurriedly explaining and highlighting this, but this is just one potential alternative or option in addition to providing on-site multifamily housing charging. Okay, next slide. Another program to address this need is looking at working with your utility or your cooperative and offering multi-charging rebate and incentive programs. So we had the opportunity to facilitate a program in Central Virginia with a local utility. And the idea was to work with multifamily dwelling sites to install charging infrastructure there. And so the idea was there was a substantial rebate that was offered that offset the cost of installation. And obviously it was a managed charging situation. So the utility would be able to have access to the charging data and monitor how that worked for the particular site. Next slide. Oh, one of the things I did want to make is, again, in terms of thinking about education outreach and partnerships on that previous slide, we met a lot of pushback from some of the developers in that community. And so again, it's really critically important to be strategic in terms of navigating those conversations and building those partnerships because, they can be a significant barrier or a significant partner. Either way, it's really good and critical to have those private-public partnerships. So next, I just want to touch quickly on electrification of rural communities. And so obviously, this is a really important area. This is Mayor Ray Leon of Huron, California, and he and his community are doing some really innovative programs around electrification as a whole. But when you start thinking about rural communities, they're home to about 20% of the US population, and they housed 70% of our roads, which is really fascinating. But when you start thinking about the equity considerations for this particular setting, the bottom line is that everyone deserves access, but the model is not a one-size-fits-all model. So let's talk about that a little bit further. So let's go on to our next slide. So when you start thinking about rural electrification and building out charging infrastructure or having infrastructure in rural communities, there could be a number of challenges. So some of the challenges in terms of just thinking about your population density, like we just shared, rural communities house about 20% of the US population. So in this community, there may be limited options around walking, biking, public transportation. On average, rural drivers are driving 50% more than folks who are not rural drivers. Also, some other unique challenges is that, the economics of this investment, because of the lower demand, lower population density, that could potentially deter the investment in installation or in infrastructure. Now, I think something else that is worth considering here is that when you start thinking about potential benefits, EVs can be particularly attractive to this particular setting, because if rural residents are driving more than their urban counterparts, they're going to spend more on vehicle fuel, vehicle maintenance. And so, transitioning to EVs, given the, lower number of parts, limited maintenance, and fueling costs can be a significant benefit to, spur that transition. They also can be utilized for resiliency purposes, so utilized as backup power if the grid goes down, like in hurricanes or in different storms. So we've seen this example play out, for time and time again. So there's another opportunity to utilize EVs in this matter. And I mean, frankly, it's a better performance and driving experience said by somebody who's been driving EVs for almost 10 years. And this is a common feedback that we hear when we facilitate, programs or engagement or work with different stakeholders, and they have a chance to experience the technology. They really see the benefit and feel the difference between utilizing an internal combustion engine vehicle and an EV. Next slide. All right, and so here, this slide is just depicting, these are some alternative, ways that you can access charging in rural communities. You can utilize rideshare programs. This is what our car sharing programs, pardon me, that's what Margaret is doing. In his community, he has a fleet of electric vehicles. I think it's about 30 vehicles or plus, and they're utilizing those to get around their community. They've installed charging infrastructure as well. So they have like a whole kind of underground ecosystem now for transportation. But there's a lot of different opportunities for investment in rural communities. But I think one of the important things that you have to consider, regardless of if you're doing multifamily infrastructure deployment or you're looking at rural communities, is doing that work on the front end. So approaching this from a critical data standpoint, making sure that you do formative work, you have those key conversations, you gather the right data to understand just what the needs, attitudes, beliefs, barriers, and opportunities to infrastructure adoption and deployment look like. Next slide. Okay, so having gone through the different challenges, needs, benefits, here are some of the key takeaways that we've seen in terms of best practices around rural electrification. So one of the things I honed in on was that there is no one size fits all approach. It's really important, as I was saying a few moments ago, doing that formative research, getting that critical data from your community or your target audience. So doing the needs assessment, that's part of that process. Also, assessing the infrastructure needs is critically important. What kind of facility are you working with? What does the electrical system look like? How is the grid capacity? All of that needs to be well understood and documented. Then thinking about education and outreach, you really have to make sure that your end users, your ratepayers understand the benefits, what's going on. You need to make sure that you're reaching out to diverse consumer markets. Other things, making sure that you have geographic coverage, the right public-private partnerships. So is there a Clean Cities organization or an EV advocacy organization that you can team up with? Can you team up with your utility or your co-ops to, try to address these issues and understand what kind of landscape you're working in? And then also there's different mobile charging programs that could be utilized in a rural setting. So it's basically charging on demand. So utilizing an app, you request a service to come meet you at your home, charge up your car, and then they go on. And it could be a one-time thing, or it could be utilizing this as a monthly service. So there's a number of different, options that could be utilized. Next slide. Okay, so then looking at innovative strategies for rural electrification, there's a whole number of different benefits or different strategies that you can utilize. So just to highlight a couple of them, you can obviously utilize the battery storage option to support grid stability, manage peak loads, again, utilize it as a resiliency strategy. Then there's other programs, so utility programs. So you can partner with utilities to offer different rebates and incentives for, deploying infrastructure and providing technical support as well. And then also there's opportunities potentially for corporate sponsorship. So you can engage local businesses and see if they will support and sponsor charging stations deployments at different facilities in the community. So I won't go into all those because I want to make sure that we have enough time for the Q&A. So we can go on to the next slide, and I'm wrapping up here. Thank you. So we know one of the common questions that people will usually have is like, okay, where do I go to get more resources and information on what's available in terms of supporting the deployment of this type of infrastructure or getting resources to address these issues. So 4 agencies that are the most common funding sources for both multifamily as well as rural electrification projects include the Department of Interior, Agriculture, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Energy. So there's a myriad of different resources, from case studies and best practices to funding opportunities to help support deployment as well as support research efforts. So, these are some of the resources that we're actually utilizing to facilitate some of our work in this space as well. Next slide. All right, so my last 2 slides is just in terms of thinking about policy recommendations. So what support is needed to help make this an easier lift is, helping to provide guidance to streamline permitted and incentive programs. So that's one piece. Also, there's, having funding opportunities to help underwrite the cost of infrastructure is critically important. So whether it's coming from federal, state, private, or you're getting resources from your local utility or cooperative, it really makes a huge impact in terms of being able to deploy infrastructure and be able to meet the needs of different stakeholders who may not have access or equitable access to infrastructure. And then also, too, it's really critically important while we're putting all this investment in infrastructure, it has to be coupled with resources to do education and outreach and engagement. So we need to be able to run a campaign that increases public awareness through targeted marketing for rural communities versus urban multifamily housing, communities. The research programs, the education marketing programs need to look very different because you're talking about 2 very distinct types of populations. And obviously, you can even cut the onion a little bit smaller and tease out different populations within those 2 sectors. So again, the idea is that we need resources to be able to do these great programs and provide this technical expertise and infrastructure. And so in conclusion, next slide. The idea is that this is, a very difficult issue. Like, we're all looking at it from different angles, and we're trying to utilize, best practices that will support providing access to all communities. And the idea is that it's going to take conversations like this and your support to be able to move the needle forward and to be able to make progress on this issue. So thank you for your time. Hope you're all still awake and looking forward to seeing you guys on the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Dr. Francis. Appreciate the presentation and all the great information. I'd love to have all 3 of our presenters come back onto camera. And if we could take the presentation down, that way we can see everybody. And we can open it up for a Q&A for anybody who has questions for any of the 3 presenters. I'm going to kick. Oh, please, if you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand, and we'll take you in order. But until I see a hand up, I'm gonna ask the first question, and it's actually for Dr. Taylor. you talked a bit about building flexibility into contracts, which I think makes a lot of sense. And I think maybe you were referring to contracts for grants or for funding or on that side of things. But I think that can also be true for commission orders and the regulations too. Could you talk a little bit more about that and who does that well, and how we should be thinking about that from a public service commission?
Oh wow, that's a tough question. I saw also that Komal was nodding as well. It's interesting to think about it not just from the case studies perspective, which is where that was coming from, was from those projects, but then to then translate this to a public service commissioner. I'm not sure. Wow, there's a lot to unpack in that question. That's great. Let's see, who does it well? I feel like it's so much of it's been kind of a case by case thing, but I think if you go at it with that principle in mind, then you can but it's going to have to be adapted to the exact project. I'm not sure if that's helpful. This particular insight comes out of our task 5 principles report and some of the case studies that were highlighted. And all of that material is available on the website. I'm not able to, off the top of my head, think of the exact great example they have to, I hate to say it, but I think this just in general approaching it with that as a criterion is a good way to go.
Yeah, if I may chime in, I think very true. I think it depends on case to case. I think it's just in general when reviewing recommendations, trying to be more forward thinking and not limiting use of technology, in the comments, BE Plan 1, and now with the BE 2 filing happening, we made recommendations where we found some of either the verbiage or the limitations on the type of chargers that was started becoming limiting, around the standards that, now trying to be more overarching is beneficial given that new technology solutions keep coming in. So limiting it to, a particular code or a particular starts becoming very limiting. So maybe trying to frame it as what's the goal we're trying to achieve, and then putting some safety mechanisms there, but not limiting it to, NACS code only, or, so as a general principle, I think the flexibility is more in trying to be forward looking as opposed to what's available in the market right now.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I like that. Yeah, thanks to both of you. Yeah, I see Eric, you got your hand up.
Thank you. My question is mostly for Dr. Francis, but I welcome other answers. And that is, I've seen analysis where the cost of the charging infrastructure can really wipe out the savings, fuel savings, and the maintenance savings, if that is volumetrically borne or some other way borne by the EV owner. And so I wondered, for the projects that you're working on, is there a way to which you are keeping track of what the cost share is for the capital costs of the infrastructure itself, or the fixed O&M that's ongoing, that is something that is not overly burdening underserved communities for these projects?
Yeah, I think one way to address that is looking at, so if you're doing a managed charging program, that's going to be a more costly investment in a multi-housing community. So one way to maybe offset the cost is to utilize level 1 charging as opposed to level 2, because that's a much more affordable strategy. That would be coupled, I think, with the importance of doing private-public partnerships and relationships. So if the multifamily community housing project, community, for instance, is going to put in the level 1 charging or offer level 1 charging, maybe the local grocery store or local community center is going to put in level 2 charging, or there's going to be some other resources within the community. The utility might be putting in DC fast charging, or maybe there's some corridor charging that will be DC fast charging. So that's, I think, speaks to the importance of having that solid private-public engagement and partnership in terms of deploying this infrastructure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I don't see any other hands up right now. I've got 2 more questions that I'd really like to ask before we go to the closed session. The first one is actually for all of you, I think. And electric vehicles really haven't been getting as much attention in the last, I don't know, let's say 6 months timeframe ish. I think there's many reasons for that. We don't need to necessarily go into that. Maybe the industry was over predicting, over hyping, who knows. But I think it's important that we do still keep equity front of mind, even if there isn't as much hype in the public sphere, and as much, maybe as a result of that, maybe not as much public funding or grant opportunities or attention from local governments too. I think that we as commissions, just because there isn't as much like hype and news around it, doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't electric vehicles still being hooked up, and a need for electrification, and a need for electric transportation for the non-vehicle owners too, as you highlighted, Dr. Taylor, which I thought was really good. How do you all keep the conversation in the right place in this different media environment?
Okay, I'm going to go first. I'll go ahead and step out there. So, for us in the work that we facilitate, it has never been just about personal vehicles. So I think for us, having that multimodal electrification focus, or including AV, is the point of is the whole point behind meeting people, clients, communities where they are. Everybody is not going to need an electric vehicle, but there may be like an electric shuttle, or the transit bus electrification might meet somebody's need more so than having a personal vehicle, or maybe it's looking at first and last mile electrification. So again, for us, when we are working in this space, we lead with that critical data and research, and working with the client and the different stakeholder groups to understand what their both historical mobility needs and angst are, so that we can work with them collectively to identify, what charging infrastructure programs are going to work best. Is it going to be something, that's catering to fleets? Is it going to be something that's focused on residential and multifamily? So really understanding the landscape that we're working in helps us keep those conversations relevant.
And I'll just add a little bit to that. Yes, on the industry front, we might have seen that some of the promises or the pace at which they wanted to roll out infrastructure, different types of vehicles, is maybe slowed down a little bit. But I think for us, you mentioned very correctly, we're trying to think of it. We don't want charging deserts in our community. We don't want certain services to not reach individual, because cities might have electrified their fleets, but there aren't charging stations in neighborhoods where that charging needed to happen. Or correctly mentioned, buses, Ubers, Lyfts, they are not going to certain parts of our communities because there isn't infrastructure equidistantly placed. So it is, I think, the job of the public officials, for organizations like ours that feel very passionately that equity needs to remain at the forefront, and we need to keep highlighting the multimodality, the continued access for everyone and the benefits of electrification, especially from a health standpoint.
And I'll just add that, so I'm at a national laboratory that's in California, right? So because of the waivers, California also helps push a large share of the market. We've also got all these federal incentives out there right now. So it's not that the EVs are not going to be supported one way or the other from a policy like state or federal level. So there's still quite a bit of interest and excitement. And one of the things in another aspect of my research, I've done some work for the EPA in terms of helping to inform the light duty rule that came out in March, was assessing some of the big consumer insights surveys that are done for the auto sector, and taking a look at big about people who are interested in purchasing as well as people who are purchasing. And you know, we've many of us have in the back of our minds an archetype of who the EV driver is from the early days of the EVs. But I'm really glad Komal mentioned and like the speed of technological change on the chargers, and Dr. Shelley mentioned level 1 is always there, right? So, you know, so it doesn't all have to be the biggest, most expensive DC fast chargers. And it's not that everyone who drives or is interested in EV is somebody that had those early generation, the early technology. It is becoming a much more diverse set of people who are interested. And I could just tell you from the demographics I was looking at just in March on JD Power data, for example, like the people who are expressed the most interest in purchasing EVs is actually not, you know, your white, you know, upper income, like middle age, like the archetype. It's actually been changing quite a bit. So, you know, and there's also a lot of interesting things happening in the used vehicle market. So we have to be kind of looking at where these cars are dispersing, and not get anchored in that old archetype of who the EV driver is, because that's changing, and there's a lot of ways that that's changing, and we need to kind of keep up with that, because it's you know, even though in the idea of like it's only the upper income person driving into a town, we've been seeing in the NEVI rollout, for example, that with an equity lens to kind of push some of the charger locations, you know, people were thinking certain rural areas wouldn't want EVs in, but people actually really would like to see the charging infrastructure because it's bringing economic development and people to have dwell times in smaller communities and things like that. So I didn't know where to go with the media perspective on this, but there's just a lot to know about. Like this is going to be coming in a lot of different ways. And anyway, that's kind of yeah.
No, I think that's a really good point. I definitely like that there's, you know, it's not just the same people who were the early adopters who are going to be the mid and late adopters. Like there's big differences and big changes that are coming, and we need to make sure that we're on top of that. So I really appreciate that. I would love to get one final question in from Commissioner Paradis from Illinois. I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks. And actually I was following up, so Dr. Taylor was kind of catching up on me as we were getting to the question, but it is on the resale market. It is on what kind of research are we doing now of, you know, are we getting 10 years? Are we getting more than 10 years? My other concern is, you know, I hear the batteries are only going 8 to 10 years, and that's with proper maintenance. So I worry, are we going to have a resale market for cars that might transition to folks that are of middle to lower income status, and then all of a sudden the batteries go out, which we know are the most expensive, you know, the piece of the electric vehicle. So do you know if there's any studies happening on that and looking into that? Because obviously most people are used to getting those 250,000 miles on a car, and we just don't know that with the EV market right now. And I think that is going to be a really important aspect here over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I can definitely say that there's quite a bit of research going on right now across the national labs, also in universities and elsewhere on this. The New York Times actually, I think just yesterday, had a sort of myth busting thing about battery lifespans, actually. So in fact, it cited one of my collaborators, John Helveston at GW, who actually has a very interesting data set on dealerships showing new cars to used cars. He's done 2 or 3 papers on the resale value of the cars and how much they're being charged. So and we'll be doing some more work with that data set in the next year or so for EPA, but that's just on my side. There's like a ton of research going on in this topic, and we can send you a lot of links. And I would suggest also looking at the Vehicle Technologies Office, the Department of Energy. Their Alt Fuels Data Center, AFDC, collects a lot of information and materials and studies like this.
Yeah, there are a number of studies that have shown there are a number of Tesla vehicles, namely like the Model S and the Model 3, that have driven over 500,000, even 1 million miles. And typically, like, the average driver may not be driving that much, but once the batteries may get to the end of their life stage, you can utilize them and repurpose them in other ways. So for instance, in Amsterdam, they took I can't remember the exact number of batteries that they utilized, but they took Nissan Leaf batteries from the first gen Nissan Leaf, and they're powering one of the football stadiums with the Leaf batteries. So there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of repurpose old EV batteries so that we have a longer life cycle of use.
I think that's such a cool use case. I'm a former energy storage project developer and did some research on that, that the reuse of EV batteries after the end of life. And I think that's just a fascinating way of repurposing and getting some extra life out of them. So yeah, really, really good question. I think we're going to have to leave it there. We're down to our final 8 minutes of this meeting. So thank you so much for all 3 of you to come and present to us today. I thought this was a really good discussion, and really appreciate you taking the time to come talk to the Electric Vehicle State Working Group.
Thank you so much for your time and your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Okay, so now we'll move to the